Hey y'all, welcome back to CFB Picks. This week we're pregaming the matchup for the Saturday between Penn State and Minnesota. Each team coming off of a bit of a rough week as Minnesota fell to Illinois and Penn State fell to Michigan by a good amount there. So before we dive into this one, we're going to break down that Michigan matchup for the first couple minutes of this video. If you're not interested in that, skip ahead a couple minutes to where we break down this week's matchup. So getting into last week's matchup, the model had this picked as a 10.5 point spread in Michigan's favor. I had it picked at a 7-point spread. I think that was pretty in line with a lot of what national media would thought. Definitely thinking, as I think some of Vegas and other folks thought that, these two rush defenses were really just going to control the game. And it actually didn't really happen in the case of either team. I think that's probably a bit surprising to hear, but for Michigan, 7.6 yards per carry is outstanding. I think a lot of people expected Penn State to be a little bit better prepared, especially with the bye week headed into this game, but that is much worse, to say the least, than a lot of their other averages this year. One game that comes to mind in this case with regard to Penn State's rush defense is the Purdue game. Yeah, it was the first game of the season, but Purdue seemed to be able to at least have some success rushing the ball. I know it wasn't elite. They didn't have huge, chunk plays in terms of yardage for rushing. But at the end of the day, their rush was only 2.8, which I thought was surprisingly low, especially after watching that game. So that grand total for Michigan, I gave them 418 yards on the day. In comparison to their average so far, which is only 212 against not great competition, their average opponent ranked 91st in the country coming into that game. So I think there's some indicators saying that Penn State's defense had a bad day, or maybe they're just not as good as people made them out to be. The statistics say that they are a pretty good rush defense, at least up until last week. What I think is more surprising, though, is Penn State's rush offense actually played better than expected. The model had both these teams right around 2 yards per carry. I would have been shocked if it was that low. But Penn State actually averaged 5.0 yards per carry, which is right on par with their season average of 4.9. And that being said, against, not great competition. I think their average opponent ranked 86th in the country coming into this matchup against who's now number 4 Michigan. So I thought those were two notable statistics, and I think in the case of Penn State is why the spread the under-over was so much greater than I think a lot of people predicted. So getting into this week's matchup, looking at Penn State's stats and at least some of their notable stats and how they've changed. We touched on a few, but currently they're averaging 414 yards per game, 378.5 yards against. Their strengths of schedule went up a good bit. Of course, they played in Michigan. They're at about 71, that being the average rank of each team they played. The yards per rush is still at 4.9, which I thought was pretty shocking given last week's gameplay. The yards per pass at 7.28, which is pretty average to good. And their explosiveness is about 0.76, which is also kind of average to good. I'd say it's maybe 33rd percentile in the country, very roughly speaking. So I think one thing that stands out is Penn State's pass offense isn't what's going to carry them. It actually might be a good balance of both. At the start of the year, I was very vocal that I thought their pass defense would have to carry them, especially after seeing the Purdue game, and even after the first half of the Auburn game, to an extent at least. But that being said, 5.0 yards per Michigan, if they can sustain that against most teams, I think they'll have a lot of success. I think that metric speaks for itself in saying that average, at least in theory, should be higher against teams like Minnesota, who have a good defense, but definitely just aren't on that same level as Michigan. So getting on to the flip side of the coin here, to Minnesota. So last week against Illinois, definitely not a good game either for Minnesota, and I mean that in terms of their season averages. Typically, Minnesota's a very good passing offense at 8.89 rather yards per pass. But last week they were only 6 for 18 with 38 yards of passing. Illinois is not, they're a good, not elite pass defense. Maybe there were some things with scheme that really kind of caught Minnesota off guard, but I think it was more so a matter of there just being an off game for their quarterback, who's typically extremely consistent and has been for years. Looking at that matchup a bit more so. So Minnesota had 142 yards per rush. Illinois only allows 2.8 yards per rush and 4.73 yards per pass. So the indicators so far in the season say that actually Illinois has a pretty good defense. With 142 yards per rush, that should translate well against Penn State, especially if the rush defense shows signs of last week. Maybe it was a bit of a bad game, so to speak, for Penn State. I do expect their rush average against at least to be a lot lower going into this game. But that is one route I think that Minnesota can exploit when it comes to this matchup. Getting into their stats further. So far, their stats actually line up at least somewhat consistently with Penn State, even though their competition has been significantly weaker. Their strength of schedule is at 91. Yards for per game are 404, and the yards against are 340. I don't know if I take a lot from the yards for per game, given the two FCS matchups so far this year. The yards per rush is at 5.3 though, and as I said before, they have a good passing offense most weeks. Still at 8.89 yards per average, even after last week per attempt. And their explosiveness is a little bit higher than Penn State's at a .078. So going on from there, we'll get into the model. So right now the model has this one actually in favor of Minnesota, 22 to 20.3. The projected yards per rush are still really low for each teams. Minnesota has a pretty good defense so far this year, and I think that's something that's maybe a bit underrated. Though I also think that speaks especially to the strength of schedule that they've played so far this year. So for Minnesota, they're averaging, at least in terms of rush yards against per game, they're only at 104.5. Which is actually better than Penn State's 136 yards per game on the ground against. But you also need to take into account that a third of Minnesota's schedule has been FCS opponents. The passing for each team, it's actually a little bit better for Penn State at 235.33 versus Minnesota's 214.8. That does take into account last week's game where there's only 38 yards though total passing. So I think that can be overlooked to some extent here. What I think shouldn't be overlooked though is the as I said before, the strength of schedule definitely favors Penn State, I think, in this case at 71 and Minnesota at 95. I've talked about this before, but when you look at strength of schedule with FCS opponents, it's really difficult to get an actual rank because when you're ranking an FCS team versus low-end FBS teams, it's really hard to say, is this team's rank equivalent to the lowest in FBS? Is it twice as low, etc.? I use estimation for that. That's how I got Minnesota at 95 for their average opponent's rank, if you will. But I think that could definitely be lower. And I think the model sees that, but I think, and as I alluded to at the start of the video, I think the model is thrown off a little bit by that, by favoring Minnesota to have the advantage here by about 1.7 points. I think that really shows up particularly in the rush yards against play, where it has Minnesota at 2.86 yards against per rush against a really good Penn State rushing attack. I think a lot of that speaks to the fact that a lot of the FCS teams couldn't rush against them. Typically, typically Penn State gets well over double that, and I expect that to happen again. What I think is interesting, though, and I think has a possibility of happening in this game, especially after last week, is Minnesota is actually projected to outrush Penn State, at least on a per play basis, by about a third of a yard, which can translate into points. And I think that's why the model is giving the edge to Penn State. It also gives Minnesota the average or the edge in average yards per pass at 7.9 to 4.9. As I said before, I don't think this Penn State pass defense is great. Minnesota's, I think, is largely untested. Going on from there, my pick is actually 30-20 for Penn State. My issue is that, or at least with Minnesota, is that they have, and while this can also be said for Penn State, they have struggled and lost against mediocre teams, or good to mediocre teams, I guess is a better way to put that. Penn State, take what you will from the Purdue game. Maybe that's a game they should have lost, but Purdue beat Minnesota convincingly. And Minnesota also lost to, a good Illinois team, maybe because they're having a bad day. But I think when you look at the rushing ceiling for both teams, I don't think we really know what Minnesota's is. And we know what Penn State's is at 5 yards per carry. I'm pretty confident Penn State can get 5 yards per carry and probably do better than the model thinks they will rushing. With Minnesota, I think this is by far the best rushing defense they've faced, which I know is saying a lot after last week. But I really think this game is going to be a test defensively for Minnesota, at least in terms of their offense. If they can bounce back and hit that 8.89 yards per attempt passing, which the model thinks they will, or at least thinks they'll come close to, if not exceed, then I think that will keep them in this game. But for now, I really think that it's the defense that I think is the matchup to watch, namely Penn State's defense versus Minnesota's offense. If Minnesota can exploit the passing game, though, I think this has the potential to may not be a shootout. I think the under-over is probably going to be maybe around 50 or so. I don't love either of these offenses. I'll take Penn State's rushing attack any day, but I think from what we've seen at the passing game so far, Minnesota's probably a bit more consistent, and it has the higher ceiling. But after last week, it's really hard to say for both teams what will dominate this game offensively, except for the rushing on each team's from each team. So going on from there, we'll get into some pathways. So I think Minnesota will win, and I think it's really going to come down to the pass game and maybe the rush game as well. Minnesota with Ibrahim back, he's been very solid this year. As a team, Minnesota has actually a higher rushing yards average than Penn State at 5.3. That may be, so that average is not adjusted specifically against their competition, so I'd take that with a grain of salt. But I think you can make the argument that Minnesota, with Ibrahim in the game, is going to have at least a competitive rush game in comparison to Penn State's. If Penn State's rush defense plays like last week, or Minnesota's O-line really steps it up, this could be a bit of a bad matchup for Penn State. If Minnesota can get the rush game going, I don't expect that to happen. And moreover, I really think that Minnesota's going to win this. What seems to be, the consistent kind of thorn in Penn State's side is the passing defense. So I think if Minnesota can get back to their average of 8.89 yards per play, and even higher, the model has them at about 10. I'm not sure that'll happen just based on the level of competition again. But I think if one of those can really hit for Minnesota, they're going to find themselves in this game, if not winning it. So 30-20 is my pick for now. do me a favor and do two favors for me, actually. First, put your pick in the video. Feel free to tell me why I'm wrong. But if you're going to, just explain why so we can lengthen the discussion a bit. And second, if you like what you're hearing, just give this video a like and subscribe for future videos. We'll be definitely doing next week's against Penn State versus Ohio State. Until next time, have a good week, and put your picks in the comments.